Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this webinar on private networks, where we're going to explore the recent development in the market and the rise of new telcos, whether they are like threats to traditional telcos or where are they going to support and partner with them in this emerging market. So before we start our webinar, I'm going to do some quick housekeeping. So just to let you know that you'll be on listen-only mode, but if you're having any trouble with your audio, feel free to drop us a comment in the chat box or in the question box, and one of our team member will be able to assist you. Also, if you have a question, any question throughout the session, feel free to drop them as well, and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the panel Q&A session at the end. And last but not least, we are recording the session, and we will be sending the recording and also the slides right after the webinar. To kick off the session, I'm going to go to give a quick intro into the private networks market, and then I'll hand over to our speakers so they can also share their thoughts and views on the market before we break into the panel discussion at the end and try and answer your questions. Right, so in the last 2 years, there have been lots of development in the market, a significant rise in the number of deployments and trials across all regions and also across verticals. So there's been a lot of adoption, for example, in manufacturing, especially the automotive sector, with big names like BMW and Ford and Toyota deploying the technology and experimenting with it in across like several sites to try and improve the efficiency of their operations, but also to provide sometimes just basic connectivity to these remote sites. Also, we see quite big adoption in the transportation and the aviation, with many airports trialing 5G to try and support their mission-critical applications, and also explore new ways to leverage 5G in developing new applications. There are also even quite adoption in education and healthcare, even though it's a niche market, but especially with the pandemic, private networks helped few schools to kind of extend their reach to students in remote areas where there was a need to distant learning during lockdown, or for some hospitals as well to kind of extend the connectivity outside their main buildings. So with all these kind of deployments and new sites, there also been an introduction to new types of players in the market, and that kind of extend from one side. We have the traditional telco players, the public ones and the regional ones, for example, Vodafone and AT&T and Deutsche Telekom, who would be using private networks to kind of connect with their enterprise customers and position themselves in that market. But there also it created opportunity to other players within the telco value chain. So the infrastructure players and the fixed and cable providers as well are looking to use the technology to kind of move into the connectivity market or strengthen their play in the connectivity market. And all the way to more of players on the enterprise side, like the neutral host and the Wi-Fi players, hyperscalers and system integrators who are more closer to enterprise customers. They're also kind of using the technology to extend their reach into the cellular connectivity and 5G play. And finally, the enterprise themselves, they are trying to, they're deploying the technology within their sites, but on top of that, it kind of offers them the opportunity to develop new kind of services and new roles in the market, and go to offer that to kind of similar players within their respective markets. And it become sort of a specialized telco providers. So these players, like I said, they are coming from different backgrounds, but they also map differently in terms of their capabilities and their assets that they can provide in the private network world. So when we're talking about a typical deployment for a private network, you would require a vertical expertise, but also the telecom expertise to build the network. And that's when we see that traditional telcos would be able to provide the telco expertise, but they lack when it comes to specific knowledge about specific sectors or markets, and the ability to customize their networks to suit the needs of these customers. Similarly, in terms of infrastructure ownership, telcos would be able to use their regional and national reach to support any need for roaming, and possibly the use of network slicing if that's one of the options or requirement. But on the other hand, vertical and enterprise players would also be more experienced in terms of in-building networking and system integration. And also one of the most important aspects of private networks is the access to licensed spectrum. And that has been one of the key assets for telcos for a very long time, but that's starting to change now with many countries opening slices of the spectrum to enterprises to allow them to acquire spectrum and build their networks on top of that. And I guess that's in a way might seem as a threat to telcos, because it kind of change it might change the way that they offer their services, but also as we can see here that there is some disparities across the regions. So that's in terms of how different countries are offering these licenses, and also the spectrum bands that these licenses are acquired in. So for example, in the US, there is the CBRS, which is it's a tiered system that offers an unlicensed portion that can be accessed by almost anyone, but there's also a licensed portion of it that is awarded through an auction. And there was an auction last year where both telcos and enterprise were able to acquire some license in it. On the other hand, there are approaches or models like in Germany that is very exclusive to enterprise in terms of how the spectrum is allocated and acquired. And it's also more it's allocated on a first come first served basis, so it's not an auction. So quite a difference in terms of how you can acquire it. And on the other, also like in China, it's completely different because it's more of a mobile play there, where the regulator has decided not to award any license for enterprises, but instead is requiring operators to offer network slicing to enterprises. However, I think with the problem with network slicing is that it's still developing, and that might be kind of a conflict between the enterprise need for an immediate access or technology to develop their solution on, or waiting for a wide-scale deployment of enabling technologies like 5G standalone, where telcos can offer their network slicing on top of that. So that's probably something that we might also discuss within the session. And with that, I think I'll hand over to Dean to explore a little bit more and share his insights.
Thanks, Ahmed. Hopefully I shouldn't overlap too much on what you've said. So if you first off, a quick introduction. I'm Dean Bubley. I'm an independent analyst, but I work also as an associate director with STL. I've worked with STL for over 10 years, and I curate the Network Futures research program there. And in this particular presentation, I'm going to talk a bit more expansively about a strategic trend that I see around a shift in the whole telecommunications industry from a world of relatively standardized network operators or telcos, whether you call them incumbents, whether you call them old telcos, is up to you, to a much more diverse landscape of new classes of service providers, which, to be honest, and I'll make the argument that they should be called telcos as well, because to all intents and purposes, they are. And I am going to again reference the role of private 4G and 5G networks as catalyzing that change, but it's not the only thing that's going on. So I want to sort of perhaps give a little bit more expansive view on this landscape of the new types of service providers and telcos that are emerging. So I'll push on through that. First off, it's worth saying that the landscape isn't completely devoid of diversity even today and for the last 10, 20 years. There's a lot of alternative service providers in amongst the telecommunications industry. Most people on the call will be familiar with mobile virtual operators, wholesale providers, various types of what are called altnets, alternative networks, in the US, sometimes referred to as CLECs as well, not necessarily fiber-based. There's regional service providers, depending on the country, whether they have national or regional. Particularly the US has long had a lot of regional network operators, and some parts of Europe as well. And then there's a sort of a second sort of group of if you like, supporting cast of other niche classes of service providers. They're not really telcos, but they go into the overall mobile internet backbone landscape, whether those are the tower companies, the internet exchanges, ISPs, both fixed and wireless, satellite providers. You could probably add in CDNs, content delivery networks, and a bunch of enterprise MSPs in this as well. So there's a fair amount of diversity to begin with, but my contention is, and particularly on the mobile side, this is changing more. I'll make a next slide, please. And you'll probably, the next slide's got a bunch of builds. So in the 4G era, most countries have had a fairly homogeneous mix of 2, 3, 4 national mobile operators, plus some MVNOs, plus some tower companies. And it varies a bit by country as to how important those other tiers of providers are. So markets such as Japan haven't tended to use tower companies as much, whereas others in, say, North America have been much more outsourcing focused. And there's been various forms of both enterprise and consumer MVNOs. Often, you'll find the telecoms industry contend that 5G allows for or enables the transformation of different industries, whether that's manufacturing or utilities or healthcare. My contention is that the first industry which gets transformed by 5G is the telecoms industry itself, and to some extent it's correlation rather than causation. There's a lot of things that are happening at the same time as 5G, so it's if you like the 5G era rather than necessarily 5G radio technology itself. But we're moving to a world where some of the existing operators are undergoing mergers, either nationally or internationally, or between fixed and mobile. There's new national networks emerging, Dish, Rakuten, for example. But there's this whole slew of other service providers that are emerging, and I'd say particularly in the private network space I'll talk about at the moment, but also more generally in providing shared infrastructure. So you've got the tower companies, there's what are called neutral host providers. There's about 10 different sorts of neutral host, some of which are basically sort of a TowerCo plus model. Some are more aligned with in-building wireless, and some are private networks that allow, if you like, inbound roaming approximately from the public networks. There's city authorities, there's municipalities that are trying to deploy their own infrastructure and become service providers in their own right for their citizens, or their health and education authorities. You've got niche mobile operators that have maybe got spectrum in for particular areas of the country, for it could be the oil industry or offshore wind and so on. And there's a number of other entities that are starting to build cellular networks with local spectrum, as Ahmed said, perhaps unlicensed as well. And I think that this sort of diversity is something which is underappreciated. We often focus on one bit of it, maybe it's on shared infrastructure and towers, but there's a wider trend here of a much wider set of network operators, owners, investors, and that has regulatory implications as well as opportunities for end users. And I should say that this is also not just and one more click please, Ahmed, not just in mobile. There's something similar that's going on in the fiber space and fixed line, not just on the access side, but in terms of backbones. You've got a lot of the cloud companies now are the largest owners of suboceanic fiber. Facebook or now Meta, Google and others, building their own physical networks, whether that's terrestrial, whether it's undersea, or perhaps space-based as well. Next slide, please. So what's happening, in my view, is that there's a bit of a paradox. We'll talk about virtualization a lot, whether that's on the core of the network and moving to cloud-native platforms in the radio network with things like Open RAN and cloud-based RAN, but also more broadly, there's I feel like spectrum as a service becoming more feasible with some of the spectrum broking and local availability models. There's cloud, public cloud for the billing support systems or business support systems, things like eSIMs dematerializing the physical plastic SIM requirements. And at one level, this is aimed at the traditional telcos wanting to reduce costs, to be able to scale their operations, to deliver new capabilities in the network. But there's a paradox. The paradox is that if you automate things and you make them cheaper and easier, then it's not just the incumbents that will exploit that. It's all the newcomers as well. The entry barriers to creating a new service provider are now much lower, particularly if you have smaller parcels geographically of spectrum, or you don't have universal service mandates as well. And so I think this paradox of if you make things easier, then everyone does it, hasn't really been particularly appreciated. And again, that's not just 5G. You could say this is true. There's a thing called Open Wi-Fi that's in tandem with Open RAN. There's various things that are going on in the fixed line in the fiber networks, which make it more simple to, obviously you still got the physical component, but the cloud management, provisioning, operations is becoming more automated and more simplified. Next slide, please. And so that's on the supply side. And then on the demand side, and this is an extract from a recent report I wrote for STL on private networks and 5G in airports. You're getting a lot more demanding customer environments, particularly in enterprise and particularly relating to private networks. The number of applications and more importantly, the specific needs in terms of the radio, in terms of security, in terms of application integration, in terms of operation business model, that is very different to the traditional, in this case, mobile operator world of essentially cookie cutter solutions. And the requirement to perhaps have different networks which are airside at the airport for the vehicles on the tarmac, inside the terminal, both for the operations of the airlines and for things like security cameras and for the passenger connectivity as well. There's associated buildings, you've got the maintenance hangars, you've got hotels, you've got the fuel depot, the de-icing station and so on. Baggage handling, you've got these massive baggage halls at airports with lots of metalwork. All of these are very, very challenging environments with very different needs in terms of the wireless performance, whether that's in terms of the throughput or the latency or just the basic physics of building out the network can be quite challenging. So this is going to require increasing levels of specialism, and not just airports, it's shipping ports, it's mines, it's manufacturing facilities, it could be a hotels and resorts. Every single environment is different, and this is a challenge for the traditional operators, which tend to be quite broad but quite shallow. And they either need to specialize in certain verticals or partner where possible. But this again is driving a requirement for the specialists, either as if you like delivery partners, but in some cases they are becoming service providers or telcos in their own right. So you've got organizations like, say, TampNet, which provides connectivity services to oil, gas, and offshore wind in the North Sea. The Gulf of Mexico, for instance, has its own spectrum rights offshore. And they're able, obviously, there's a whole set of characteristics you need in terms of not just propagation across water rather than land, but you have to think about things like the safety where you've got explosive gases, and what that means in terms of the physical hardware you employ. And so I think that this, at one level, the specialization is going to take us away from this world of automation. But then you see things like the Amazon private networks, private 5G initiative, which looks to template some of this, although I suspect that will get wrapped up into more vertical specific offerings as well. Next slide, please. And I think one other point to make here is that there's communication service providers emerging at different scales and scopes. And so you might find that there are specific providers that are targeting utility networks. It may well be the utility itself is a service provider, and they've long had fiber networks and internal wireless for their machine-to-machine connectivity or grid control. And it may well be that, subject to regulatory approval, whether it's the utility companies or the rail networks or highway networks, they start providing services, perhaps B2B or fixed wireless access to nearby communities. Perhaps you'll find that they provide services on a sort of semi-public basis to other utility companies or other field forces. So there's some in the US now which are sort of service providers in their own right. They may well have a geographic coverage larger than a traditional MNO, because the utility network tends to have to cover the rural areas and unpopulated areas, which tend to be at the bottom of the list for most traditional telcos. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got absolutely tiny micro networks that might just be covering, a private network in a stadium or even a ship or a plane. And I think in the middle, you've got an interesting set of campus-size, city-size networks, and they start to become service providers in their own right because they often have tenants. So go back to the airport example, it's not just there for the airport authority, it's there for the airlines, the fuel companies, the catering companies, the maintenance providers, the public safety agencies, and so on, are tenants on that network. And so it starts to look like a micro MNO. And I think you'll see that for some city authorities as well as perhaps business parks, big property developments, and so on. Next slide. So I've just thrown up some logos here, and some of these will be recognisable. Sorry, back one, Ahmed. So some of these will be recognizable to people on the call, and I've deliberately thrown in a few random ones in here just to keep people on their toes. So companies like Telet is a neutral host provider based in the UK. There's Hanha, which does private networks in warehouses, and also has an MVNO business for if you like things like package and parcel tracking. So you can have the private network in the factory and the IoT MVNO when it's being sent outside of the plant, the origination of the plant. AST Space Mobile is interesting. They claim to be building satellites that can do direct to handset mobile communications from a few very large satellites in low Earth orbit. Not commercial yet, we'll see what happens, but certainly Rakuten and I believe Vodafone have partnerships with them. There's Hub One, which is the internal service provider for Paris airports. Starry, which is a wireless internet service provider in the US. Siemens, which is providing connectivity as a managed service as part of industrial automation, and so on. And there's a set of really interesting niches here, and I don't have time to talk about all of these classes of telco, and we could debate as to whether some of them are, is it a telco? Is it a service provider? Is it a managed service provider? Is it a bit of each? And I think one of the challenges for the industry is those definitions break down. And you'll often find with private networks that companies will have multiple delivery methods. They might have a turnkey where they hand it over to the enterprise, it's just built for them. They might have an operate and then perhaps transfer at a later point. It could be a full managed service. The ownership models, payment models, all very different, even from the same company. Last slide, please. And so what does this mean in terms of the reaction from the traditional operators? Well, I think one of the important things from my point of view is attitudinal change. I still get this sort of them and us attitude. And whether it's talking about internet companies, whether it's talking about new classes of infrastructure and service provider, there's very much a sort of a sense of we've been here for 100 years offering service, therefore we're different. And I think that is complacent and naive and will need to change. And I think it's not just the individual operators and their management that's in that group. I would see a lot of the existing industry bodies fall into that trap as well. No, to some extent, they're driven by their members, but I think that it's incumbent upon those organizations to expand their membership and to treat those members, even in different groups, as peers rather than sort of class A and class B, which I very much sense is the case at the moment. Otherwise, I think there's going to be new organizations formed. So there's the European Private Network body, UENA, that was announced in the last few weeks, for example. I think there's a lot of partnerships and perhaps in future M&A that will occur here, where I think that you will see collaborations between these different subtypes of service provider. I think private 5G is probably where it's going to start, but there may well be other categories in the consumer space or data centers as well. I think a big challenge for traditional operators is around dealing with this issue of customization and specialization. You know, particularly if you're used to selling the same thing to 100 million people, it's a real challenge if you suddenly have to do a one-by-one customized systems integration approach with a big professional services team. So I think that that's going to need some realignment and perhaps some thinking about resourcing, automation where you can, but there's still going to need to be feet on the ground as well. I think some of the categories I've talked about are going to explode. I think private 5G is one of them. I threw up there the decentralized operator more out of amusement than anything else. I'm not a big believer that we're suddenly going to be running the entirety of the world's telecoms infrastructure on blockchain or paying for it with cryptocurrency anytime soon. But I threw that one in there as an outlier. But I think there's a bunch of stuff around fixed wireless access, around our cities going to be able to do this, and the jury's out, to be honest. I think that internalizing this idea that the automation is great, but it's an ingredient of democratization. Everyone can use automation, and you're seeing that absolutely with what Amazon's recently done with private networks. I think that there's some interesting regulatory dimensions here as well, and I think that both in terms of lobbying from the industry, but also from within governmental agencies, I think this new landscape is not really on anyone's horizon. We talk about supplier diversification. What we're going to get here is demand diversification, and a whole set of different service provider types which don't really fit all sorts of laws about lawful intercept. How do you deal with hybrid providers, which are public and private? What happens at the boundaries? Who determines what is a public network and what does that actually mean? If it's a closed user group or semi-closed, you have guest access and so on. I think all that has to be looked at again in the era of the cloud. It's not like the past where you could say a telco is a company which provides PSTN minutes, for telephony. And I think that we need to have some serious thinking. And last thing I'll say is watch out over the next couple of weeks. I'm finishing off writing a bit of a wildlife spotter's guide to all the different categories of new classes of telco and service providers. So that's in preparation at the moment. Okay, thank you. I've probably gone on too long. Apologies for that.
All right, thanks a lot, Dean. I think we are going to move to Joeri now. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm there now. Okay, thank you, Dean. Thank you, Ahmed. I hope you see my screen now. So I'm Joeri. I'm Chief Operating Officer of Citymesh. We are a Belgian operator. We call ourselves the fourth operator. We're next to the traditional MNOs, the new operator that focuses on everything that has to do with mobile private networks. Our history of over 15 years is mainly in Wi-Fi networks in cities and doing niche connectivity for offshore services, for example. But over the last years, mainly because we have acquired the 5G frequency nationwide and also a 4G license nationwide for the next 20 or so years, our main focus has become mobile private networks. So our focus is B2B, mission critical and business critical connectivity. And we do that with a team of, it's still 80 people on the slide, it's about 100. We grow at about 30 to 40% organically in the last years. And the team is also, of course, growing along. Our main shareholder is Cegeka, which is one of the biggest IT data center application players in Belgium. And they see a strong trinity of innovation in the next decade, driven by artificial intelligence, cloud and containers in a managed service model, but where, as previously said, 5G and mobile private networks will play a leading role because it's the transport layer of the communication. And as the CEO of Cegeka calls it, it's the hand and feet of the cloud. It brings the cloud close to the application, close to the user. So that's also why we have that focus on mobile private networks. What do we see at the moment as relevant markets in Belgium? We have built about 40 networks up until now. 20 of them are permanent and 20 of them are on a temporary basis. We deploy private networks at festivals on a temporary basis in a full as a service model. But as already mentioned, the real mobile private network market for critical connectivity now is factories, is terminal operators, ports and airports, logistics centers. That's where we see the main connectivity needs at the moment. And we do expect in Belgium that hospitals will be a big market as well. So having connectivity on licensed spectrum that is guaranteed to be used only by the company where you provide the connectivity is one of the critical differentiators for now. But we do believe that in the future, the near future, even 3 to 5 years, that it will be all about the over-the-top services, the connected devices, the connected people and the applications on top of the network on the one side, and on the other side, being able to provide connectivity that roams between private, semi-public, public networks, all in a seamless manner, including traditional native voice, but also push-to-talk, P2X applications on top of that network. More than what we expected, the right side, the over-the-top services, is one of the most important parts, and I'll come back to that with some examples later on. So, as already said, we're now mostly in Belgium in the full left, the public networks operated by the MNOs, and the full right, the private networks. Yeah. Sorry? Okay.
I think we're having a connectivity issue. Can you?
Okay, great, fantastic. Apologies. So thank you, everyone. And I'm sure Joeri will be coming back in a little bit. So before I continue with my presentation, and I'm going to shut this down here. No. Okay, great. I want to tell you a little bit about myself and tell you about Cellnex. So I have been in the private networks business for almost 8 years, starting with UK Broadband, which owned a ton of spectrum on its own. So it was a unique opportunity to really explore what private mobile networks look like. And our first customers there were Heathrow and the Port of Felixstowe. So terrific start in the private networks business, 4G, now we're looking to 5G. So to tell you a little bit about Cellnex, and I know that Dean has talked about the other telcos. So Cellnex is a 36 billion euro, 6.1 billion investment in the UK, about a 36 billion euro company based in Barcelona. It is European wide, and they are Europe's largest tower co. We talked a little bit about how tower cos are diversifying with about 128,000 sites throughout Europe. Now, what we did, and we talked about acquisitions as well, is Cellnex bought a company called Edgecom. Edgecom's based in Finland, and they were an early adopter of the classic private networks, and they have over 35 between us and Edgecom and Cellnex. We have over 35, I think bordering on nearly 40 private networks deployed, permanent private networks deployed throughout Europe. So just a bit about why private networks, and then we're going to get into, the twos and fros of telcos, standard telcos, and alternative telcos. So private networks, why are companies looking at private networks? I have to say that I looked at this list and I applied it to a variety of different sectors, and I found that these requirements, these kind of drive to private networks, really work for a variety of different sectors. And I think Joeri's mentioned a few, including ports, airports, and manufacturing. They want to track assets. They have hazardous environments and safety issues to deal with. They've got unplanned maintenance that throw off their supply chains. They've got data security they really want to control. So what does a private network do for an enterprise, and why private? Well, we'll talk a little bit what it does. First of all, it provides an enterprise with safety. And when I'm talking about safety is a huge driver for enterprises. And it could be everything from safety, if you look up here in a port and a key crane alongside of a large vessel, you've got an individual going into the field, the dangerous field of where containers are moving back and forth. And instead, if you can do something like autonomous key cranes or remote control key cranes, you don't have an individual going into that very unsafe area and climbing 40 meters in order to go above a vessel. Autonomous vehicles, in order to, again, take people out of jobs that are boring, repetitive, and also in unsafe fields. And everything from that to CCTV, being able to fix things better. And the other thing private networks provide, reliability and more productivity, because by being able to implement all this, a business can increase their productivity. What I found with private networks, though, is the core thing, and I know Joeri's talked a little bit about AI, data analytics, where the network core is, etc. But the key things driving private networks right now is control, I think, and really being able to have the reliability that they need. So if we look at reliability, and I think hopefully this will build completely, we look at a public network. From a standard telco, and a public network is going to provide you coverage, but it's not going to guarantee the coverage where you need it. You might actually need it in the corner of a building, or you might not actually need it in between two container stacks. The public network is not designed to be that way, and it won't be designed to be that way because they are designed to appeal to the masses. A private network gives you the capacity and coverage where you need it, when you need it. It provides you with SLAs. It also provides you with control. And I'll talk a little bit more about control in a few slides. And it also provides you that availability and reliability. So when we talk about, and this might be a bit of a provocative slide, existing telco versus new telco. I think Dean said a few interesting things. I'm going to reflect on those things before I get into the slide. Is he talked about MVNOs. When you think about what an MVNO is, actually a partner of a mobile operator. And the reason why MVNOs came into being is because there were aspects of the mobile operator business that an MVNO wasn't wanting to deal with, or someone else found an opportunity and the mobile operator said, or the telco said, you know, go for it. Same with fiber. Other fiber providers have popped up because there's a demand, and the likes of BT in this world said, I couldn't possibly put fiber everywhere. So I think the same thing holds true for private networks. There's an area that existing telcos, they have revenues and systems existing to protect. They are usually, but not always, much bigger, have much bigger businesses in this mobile business, and to adapt is slow and costly. They focus for private networks on large enterprises. They have an advantage in that they are a known name oftentimes for partnering and building an ecosystem in order to bring business to a large enterprise, but they're not always the go-to for what the ecosystem for private networks, which is a lot of startups, a lot of interesting edgy businesses, the AI, the machine learning that are really becoming a part of why 5G is growing. And their systems really accommodate the masses and not individual needs. And for all intents and purposes, private networks are really, it is a standardized deployment in that putting a base station up is putting a base station up. What's different in private networks is the applications have to be tailored for. And so one private network deployment to another is very different based on what applications, where those applications are, how many there are of them, what the upload and download speed is, etc. And that is the care that needs to be taken in building a private network. So new telcos, obviously, a lot of those businesses have a core area just focused on private networks, which makes them a bit more dynamic and agile. And we can argue about that, but I'm just going to assert that today in a general way. There are also many of these new telcos are focused on sectors, and they become experts in delivering business. I think there's a business out there that is expert in delivering different sectors, et cetera, and creating an ecosystem around there. And they're specialized. So my last point is, what's next? What's the future? Because we have all these private networks that are really coming to the fore, which are we creating a network of networks here? And I think I'd love to throw it over to Dean in a little bit to say, you know, is this what we're creating? But with these private networks, the enterprises who are deploying the private networks really have control. They have control of who is on their network. So in the example that I think Joeri was beginning to give about airports, they have all of these different entities that come onto the airport to help run the airport. The airport actually has a choice of who gets to roam onto their private network, or who gets to access that private network and who does not. And so enabling that sort of network of networks to really be custom tailored to benefit the enterprise. So that's me. Here are my contact details. If you have any questions directly, please feel free to reach out to me, and I will turn it over, hopefully, to Joeri. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. I will try again. Hopefully it works perfectly. Otherwise, please interrupt me. All right, I'll continue. And I think, yeah, it fitted perfectly in between the presentation, because it, like you said, it's all about having control over who comes onto the network, at which conditions, which priority they get, and to which user group or application group they are linked. And that's what an enterprise, and more specifically an airport wants to control for itself. So being able to be an operator that supports an airport in those cases, you need to be a lot deeper into the use cases, the user groups, the business models, the priorities of an airport than even we expected. So when we built the network, and we have built an outside coverage of the network, but also an indoor coverage, both 4G and 5G. So a 5G NSA network standalone on a local redundant core. It was mainly about providing critical push-to-talk, push-to-video, push-to-data in replacement of the existing Tetra communications. Because the ongoing critical communications were the main driver for investing in a private network. Here is a small summary of what the advantage for an airport is. They wanted to create a shorter time to market for innovation, and that the simple cut the cable in an airport can gain several weeks and months in enabling new applications on top of the network. For example, deploying a COVID test center with just being able to put the CPE on the COVID test center and having critical managed connectivity there immediately, yeah, that just makes a lot easier. So they wanted one mission critical network that they could be able to slice themselves with a guaranteed coverage, with a redundant core on site that could remain operational even if everything else went down. They wanted to increase their safety and security on the premises, but also, and that has been a big issue in the past, for all the initiatives they took on IoT, on tracking and tracing and so on, they were all on separate networks, all managed separately by separate companies. They wanted to have one standardized, secured, consolidated network to be able to run their business critical, mission critical operations on top of it. But just to make it clear that I think as a new mobile private network operator, the main difference is flexibility. You need to be able to run completely private networks, include them in an offering with public networks, make semi-public networks, but also do it in a lot of different business models. And the business model that was created for the airport in Belgium was one where the networks are invested, but there's also a revenue generation model, a service catalog that lives on top of those networks, not for Brussels Airport Company alone, but also for the 200 other companies that are present at the airport. So in the values of a partnership, you can then operate each at its core strength with one SLA responsibility and one service catalog commercialization offering. And what is that? What is the content of that service catalog? That's scanning, that's augmented reality, that's also detection, that's also critical push-to-talk on smartphones that can run over the private network, but also have the public network as a backup for that. The reason why they combined it with their trunking or Tetra network is that they would have a clear evolution scenario between the old technology and the new technology with one key responsible for that. For us as a niche operator or a new operator with a focus on private networks, the differentiators were that we have spectrum, 4G, 5G, standardized, leased, dedicated spectrum in the primary bands where we can ensure them that there will be a large ecosystem of devices available, but also that we could help them and innovate the airport by running new applications on top of that network. And I'll give a small example of that. One of the examples is footfall analytics, where we can detect, where we can use edge computing to detect several things, but also be able to detect, for example, is someone wearing their safety helmets? Are they wearing their safety vests? Is it too busy COVID related in a certain area? Does something need to happen there? You can do that completely safely with a solution like footfall analytics. This is one of the solutions we provided there. The other one is building drone operations on top of their private networks. You could say airports and drones doesn't seem like a good combination, but it is. Using a drone to do perimeter inspection, bird control, but as well assist in emergency operations, is very useful in an airport. And the ideal way to do it is what we did is, for example, I hope the video works, I'll just skip it a bit with purpose of time, is we operated the drone from 100 kilometers further and we flew it on the airport. So the drone is connected to the private network to the data center, and that way we can operate a drone with a pilot that is 100 kilometers further, and with a drone that is locally set on an airport with a docking station completely ready to go at all times. I'll send a link over for anyone who would like to know more about that. Other markets we serve and where we see a large disruption is offshore. In the offshore market, we have built networks around the wind farms, but again, in another business model. Here we invest the networks ourselves and we commercialize them in a pay-as-you-consume model for the different ships that work and operate around those wind farms. We have covered the Belgian and Holland coasts, and also a part in the UK in Triton Knoll. That is expanding quite quickly because also the running of the operations of the wind turbines is increasing, has an increasing need of always-on critical connectivity. Another thing we see on top of those networks is a strive towards automated vessels that can be controlled centrally. So having remote operations is one of the key enablers of private networking. Being able to remotely operate a crane or a vessel or a straddle carrier is where you can feel that using a public network will never be enough, and also using a Wi-Fi network will never be enough. Cities is one of the bigger markets for the future, but we do expect that cities will not invest in networks themselves. So we have decided in Belgium that we will build the first 3 to 4 smart city networks in the coming year, also building on our legacy Wi-Fi networks to be able to do all these applications in a use case as a service model towards the cities, but also offering them the needed security and control over the network. I see that we're running to the end of the time, so I'm going to focus on one more, being terminal operators. This is where the high demand is at the moment. It's often a completely isolated network, completely redundantly built, where straddle carriers, ships, people on the site need to connect and need to communicate over a guaranteed network. And the way to do that is to build a complete coverage of that specific site and then enable all devices that run and walk and operate on the site, the straddle carriers, the cranes that are on the site, the straddle carriers, the half trucks, the people, the critical communications, to all enable them on the network, provide them with a complete flawless coverage with a redundant core on their site, and to also be able to do positioning on that site through localization. Other markets we see for the next is logistics and retail. And for the future, we see a very big market in healthcare. So if I would summarize it, I think Spectrum has enabled us to get a head start. But for the future, our biggest differentiator will be roaming and integrating with public networks. And secondly, being able to support customers in their over-the-top applications in their use cases, and also being able to do that in different business models than the different models that are known now from the MNOs. So flexibility is key, I believe. Ahmed, are you still there, or Dean?
Yep. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Joeri. And apologies everyone for the connectivity issues. We will be sending the recording and the slides soon after the webinar. We have lots of questions, but I think we're running out of time, so I'll try and pick a few of them. I think one of the interesting questions here is, do you see convergence between 5G and Wi-Fi And if so, what are the use cases would be for such convergence?
From our side, we strongly see a relation between Wi-Fi and 4G, 5G private networks. For example, in an airport, Wi-Fi will remain the big capacity driven technology to provide connectivity for passengers. And we do believe that that will be the same in healthcare, for example, where for the patient, Wi-Fi will remain the main connectivity layer for the future. But Wi-Fi cannot be stretched to support the operational needs of those hospitals and airports. I think that's where it lies.
And I was going to say the difference with Wi-Fi and private networks is mission criticality. So I totally agree, and they will exist next to each other.
Yeah, I'd see Wi-Fi more indoors in particular. The other thing to think about here is around skills levels, and a lot of enterprises have plenty of Wi-Fi engineers. Globally, there's probably 100 times more Wi-Fi engineers in enterprise than there are 5G engineers. That gap will change over time, but as you know, that interesting thing is whether that gap closes faster than Wi-Fi 6, 6E, 7 evolve, which closed some of the performance and technology gap as well. So there's going to be hybrid scenarios of varying types.
Interesting. Yeah, I think we have also another kind of technical question here about the backhaul. And the question is, what will be the best backhaul for private networks? And is Satcom finally becoming affordable?
I guess it really depends on the requirements, the location of the enterprise that needs a private network. It really, it's all criticality based, frankly. Dean, over to you.
Yeah, it's going to be also depend on the location. If you're Telstra doing a mine in Papua New Guinea, you're not going to have an awful lot of options. On the other hand, if you're doing a private network like Heathrow, there's no shortage of fibre around. So you're not going to use satellite for backhaul on that.
Yeah, it also depends on the use case, I believe. If you have a private network just to communicate to each other and to interchange data with each other, then backhaul becomes less important. But of course, if it's an immediate link to the application that is in the cloud and that is needed for all operations, then it will need to be a redundant, dedicated line towards that application.
Right. And in terms of, I guess, the partnerships between all the new telcos, there's a question whether they can help one another grow. Could they do something like data offloading or partnering or M&A?
There's already a lot of M&A going on. So I think absolutely. And I think we'll see some consolidation just based on what Dean said before. You know, there's a finite number of resources available. So there's going to have to be some consolidation.
Yeah, no, and I think you may well see whether it's cross-border, whether it's cross-sector. Yeah, I question whether having someone who's specialised in industrial is necessarily going to have too many synergies partnering with, I don't know, someone doing outside broadcast for sports events and hanging small cells off of helicopters. But maybe. I think that it's going to be very case by case.
Yeah, the way, and it's on a smaller scale, of course, in Belgium. The way it's happening here is that we position ourselves as the one that is specialized in mobile private networking, but we will not be able to be a specialist in broadcasting or in e-health services all at the same level. So being able to build those partnerships, that's at the core of what we do. We just explore solutions, we validate them on the network, and we try to bring an end-to-end service towards the end customer. So it's all about partnering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can take one more question before we end the session. I think so. One of the questions is about the security of private networks. and how you manage the CapEx and OpEx for securing private networks.
So CapEx and OpEx for securing private networks, it really depends on your service provider and how they negotiate with you, CapEx and OpEx, what you can afford, and also the criticality of the business that you're going to be putting in. It's really a conversation in my mind. With regard to security, private networks, 5G, 4G, you can't rock up with a Wi-Fi system next door and bring it down. A lot more secure. You're inherently more secure by being able to control who goes on your network. Just by the SIMs and the eSIMs, you control it. I'm sure there's a much more complex answer that will take a lot longer, but Dean, Joeri.
Yeah, no, I was going to say hybrid scenarios are quite challenging from security. If you've got a factory, for example, you're going to have some of your, it could be some of your robots and automated vehicles might be using 4G or 5G, but if you've got tools, they're probably on Wi-Fi or maybe even some weird IoT protocol that is proprietary. And so at some point you need to have really good sort of convergence of security and some sort of management layer. But it's the thing I would say is it's not going to be homogeneous, and I think it's one of the challenges is going to be how you deal with those complex environments with lots of legacy things.
All right, I guess we reached the end of our session, and apologies again for the technical issues, but we'll be sending the recording and the slides after the session is over. And I'd like also to remind you that we are having another private network webinar in February, and that one will explore the private networks in manufacturing. So please check our website and register to that one. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for participating in this session and for all the insights and the views that they shared. And also I'd like to thank the audience for joining us and for all the interesting questions that they submitted. And with that, thank you, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.